What if everything you've ever relied on to understand human history, from your school textbooks to the grandest museums on Earth, was just the tip of a carefully sculpted iceberg? What if what we've been taught is a deliberate simplification and the more complex, more unbelievable parts were stripped away thousands of years ago, scattered among the ashes of burned libraries, in the missing manuscripts and in the sealed-off archives of ancient monasteries? There might be another story waiting to be uncovered. A story about origins, about purpose, about humanity's connection to beings that go far beyond the boundaries of this world. These ancient texts, whether written in uniform sacred symbols or passed down through whispered traditions, seem to be telling us something modern science isn't ready to hear or doesn't dare to acknowledge: that we're not alone in our evolution. That another hand, maybe more than one, has intervened along the way. In tonight's episode on Bedtime History, we'll brush away the thick layers of time and listen closely to the stories that were once dismissed as myths. Stories that might actually hold the missing piece to understanding who we really are. Not to replace history, but to ask a deeper question. How much of humanity's memory has been stolen? And who rewrote the first chapters? Before we begin, thank you so much to everyone who's been with us and supported this channel. We truly appreciate you. Just a heads up, tonight's episode dives into some theories that might shake your trust in the mainstream version of history. So, listen carefully and keep an open mind. If there's a hidden truth about humanity's origins, maybe it's not buried in some forgotten history book, but encrypted within the world's oldest writings. In 1799, a carved stone was discovered in the Egyptian town of Rosetta. On its surface were three scripts: ancient Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Because scholars still understood ancient Greek, they were finally able to decode Egyptian hieroglyphs after nearly 1,500 years of silence. That artifact became known as the Rosetta Stone, a name that now stands for anything that can help us unlock a lost language and open a door to ancient knowledge. But what if there are other Rosetta Stones? Not just ones that decode language, but that unravel the true story of human origins. Not mythology, but streams of information hidden in symbols, astronomy, mathematics, sound, and memory buried in ancient texts spanning from Sumer to India, from Egypt to Central America. The ununiform tablets of the Sumerians, the oral Vedic hymns passed down for millennia in the Indian subcontinent, the intricate carvings in Egyptian tombs, and the still undeciphered Mayaglyph codes. What if these weren't just cultural artifacts, but fragments of a knowledge system that once existed but no longer belongs to us? A language not just of gods but of cosmic cycles, human nature, and scientific principles that shouldn't have been possible without the help of someone more advanced. Why did the Sumerians describe the planets of the solar system in such precise detail, including ones invisible to the naked eye? How did the ancient Egyptians possess astronomical knowledge so accurate that we've only recently confirmed it with modern technology? And why do civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of miles all tell of the same event? Beings that came from the sky. What if ancient texts aren't just legends, but records written in symbolic language? And what if they're maps? Not maps to a place, but to an entirely different level of understanding. A cosmic Rosetta Stone that's right in front of us, but no one knows how to read it yet. In some of these texts, we find subtle descriptions of vibration, of sound giving birth to matter, of sacred numbers like the golden ratio, and of time cycles that modern quantum physicists are only now beginning to explore again. Could it be that long before conventional history even begins, There was a deeper knowledge, and all we have left are forgotten fragments. Not every text needs a dictionary to be translated. Some can only be understood by asking, why does this exist? Who left here? And are we misreading what our ancestors were truly trying to say? When the question of our origin echoes through the silence left behind by ancient texts, what's strange isn't that we find one answer. It's that we find many. Different languages, different names, different forms. Yet somehow they all seem to point back to the same place. A place no modern civilization clearly remembers, but every ancient one seems to hint at in its own way. From Mesopotamia to the Nile, from the Altiplano to the Indus Valley, from the Andes to the Tigris Plain, every culture holds a creation story. And what makes them striking isn't how different they are, but how eerily similar. As if they're all trying to recall a shared memory filtered through different cultural lenses. Like the same scene projected through distorted screens. In Sumer, humans didn't just emerge naturally. They were created by the Anunnaki, not out of compassion, but to serve, to labor, to carry the burdens of gods who came from the sky. In Egypt, the first dynasties weren't the slow rise of farmers becoming kings, but a reign of the Neteru, divine beings who descended, ruled for tens of thousands of years, and then withdrew into another realm. In India, the Vedic scriptures speak of a time when the Devas and Asuras clashed in a world where humans were just byproducts of a larger war between powerful races. In the Andes, the Inca told of the first teachers, the Viracha, who came from the ocean bearing knowledge of building and creation only to vanish back into the mist. And in the Hopi tradition of North America, 3 worlds had already collapsed before the current one was born, each destroyed when cosmic order was broken. Not one of these stories places humanity at the center. Not a single ancient text describes a slow, linear evolution from primitive to civilized. Instead, every story implies that humanity was the result of some kind of intervention, sometimes divine, sometimes accidental, sometimes necessary, but never random. And the most curious part, each tale includes a rupture, a fracture in time, when an old world ended and a new one began. Sometimes by fire, sometimes by water, but always with a moment when order reversed and memory was cut off. If that's just coincidence, is one too consistent to ignore? And if it's the product of collective imagination, then that imagination seems to share a single obsession. Something lost at the very beginning. Maybe that's why ancient texts don't just preserve content. They preserve the shape of memory. They don't tell stories in a straight line the way modern history does. They spiral. They loop. They return to the same point over and over again, as if to say what we thought was gone is still there. We've just forgotten the words to name it. In these ancient writings, collapse isn't just part of the cycle. It's a mechanism, a deliberate act, like a system rebooting itself, but keeping the original code buried deep in its core. And if that's true, then maybe each ancient civilization wasn't a brand new start, but a recovery effort, a reconstruction by humans, or maybe by someone else, trying to rebuild a lost knowledge system. Through architecture, through rituals, through myth, they were unconsciously recreating what had been destroyed in a previous age. That's why we see pyramids across Egypt, Mexico, and China. Different materials, different cultures, same form. We see recurring symbols. Spirals, world trees, winged beings appearing across continents with no known trade routes or contact. as if every civilization was piecing together fragments of a blueprint that had once been whole, as if memory had been erased, but the fingers still traced the outlines. And in those similarities, we find the first fracture, the break in the official story, a crack in the linear theory of evolution, a challenge to the ideology that says the past was just a string of mistakes made by the less enlightened. Because when all ancient cultures speak of a higher intelligence, one not of this region, not of this time, not of this biology, then maybe the real question isn't who created humanity, but why were we made to forget? What if the first fracture in history didn't happen in some event, but inside human memory itself? Then maybe what we're looking for isn't a monument, but a seam. A stitch in the timeline where ancient civilizations tried to repair something that had once been erased. And what's strange is that in this attempt to patch the past, most ancient texts don't begin with creation, but with what came after. An ending no one quite remembers. Just vague traces. A great flood, a fire from the sky, a trembling of the earth, a vanishing of the gods followed by the birth of a new kind of human. In India, the Puranas speak of 4 great ages of humanity: Satya Yuga, Taga, Dvapara Yuga and Kali Yuga, each one ending in a cataclysm followed by a reset. In ancient China, the legends of mythical rulers like Fuxi, Shennong, and the Yellow Emperor are all tied to eras that came after massive disasters when humanity had to be taught again how to track time, plant crops, and worship. In Maya inscriptions, the long count calendar doesn't begin at the creation of the world, but at the moment when cosmic order was re-established. And in the Book of Enoch, the chaos brought by the fallen angels forced God to destroy an entire generation of humans and begin again, choosing a pure seed, a human who carried only a filtered memory. These texts don't tell stories of evolution. They describe a recovery program, not a grand birth, but a data restore. Their main characters weren't born naturally. They were selected, prepared, guided to re-establish order. Noah wasn't the smartest man. He was the one who was protected. Manu wasn't the strongest. He was the one who survived. Viracha wasn't just a creator god. He was the one who walked the mountains after the Great Flood, teaching people how to rebuild. And if such a reset program truly happened, the question isn't just who was behind it, but also what was preserved and what was deliberately erased. Ancient texts rarely give us the full memory. In fact, they often portray the loss of memory as part of the plan. In the Rig Veda, there are verses that speak of fragmented speech where humans could no longer understand each other and had to relearn everything from scratch. In the Bible, after the flood, God makes humanity speak different tongues at the Tower of Babel, so they can no longer act as one. In other traditions, memory is hidden inside rituals, geometric symbols, encoded songs, and the rhythms of the stars, as if consciousness itself was tucked into the very structure of the cosmos, only accessible to those who knew how to listen. The point isn't just that something was forgotten, but that it was meant to be forgotten. Not everything was destroyed, just enough. Enough to make sure humans no longer remembered where they came from, but also just enough for them to keep going, to rebuild, to believe they were at the beginning when in truth they were walking a path that had already been walked only without a map. And so the question becomes sharper. If every ancient tradition speaks of a wisdom that once existed was erased, and then reinstalled in a new form, can we really say that our memory is whole? Or are we just running a simplified program written after someone hit reset on the entire system? Maybe that feeling of something missing, That subtle sense we're trying to remember something no one ever taught us is the last remnant of the first memory. A memory not written in language, not carved in stone, not etched in bronze, but embedded deep in the very architecture of consciousness itself. And if that's the case, then maybe ancient texts aren't containers of memory. Maybe they're clues meant to help us unlock it again. If memory was once rewritten, then maybe ancient texts weren't just meant to be read with words, but remembered through something far quieter. Symbols. Because some truths can't be spoken. Some meanings don't fit inside grammar. And fragmented language simply can't carry them. Those truths had to be preserved in shapes. Shapes that don't speak but resonate. That don't explain but exist within everything. Shapes that don't belong to any one culture yet show up in all of them. And that's where something strange begins to emerge. From Sumer to the Andes. From Egypt to Polynesia. We see symbols so strikingly similar it makes you wonder. Were these people all writing in the same language? A language that never had a sound. When we look at ancient temples, ritual masks, pottery patterns, even the layout of old villages, we start to notice something modern minds often miss. Nothing is random. There's structure. Not just physical structure, but symbolic logic. Spirals interwoven. An eye framed by wings. A figure standing inside a circle. A tree branching in 4 directions. A serpent coiled around a stone column. Paired shapes arranged in perfect symmetry. And what's remarkable is they repeat. Not in one place, but everywhere. The Sumerians carved twin serpents on the pillar of Ning'ish Zeta. A form later transformed into the twin snakes around the medical staff in Western medicine. The Egyptians placed wings around the Eye of Horus. A motif still found in sun worship symbols today. The Inca shaped dual serpents forming a cosmic balance, mirroring the Aberos of Greece and the twin forces in Hindu astronomy. On the islands of Polynesia, spiral glyphs were etched into stone to mark places where the world of the living touched the world of spirits. In China, the Tai symbol isn't just philosophy. It's a map of internal motion. No one has proven these civilizations ever met. No one's uncovered trade routes from the Tigris to the Andes. And yet, the symbols travel across space, across time. They don't need translation. No one taught them yet. Everyone knew, as if there were a second language, one outside time, where ancient cultures didn't learn from each other, but remembered something they all once knew. Something buried deep in collective memory. Now faded, but not gone. Symbolic language doesn't work like modern language. It doesn't explain. It awakens. We don't study symbols the way we study words. We simply recognize them. They don't speak to the brain, but to something deeper. To that space where image meets emotion. Where a glance sparks a memory we can't quite name. That's why the ancients never wrote without imagery. Why rituals always had spatial design. Why sound always had shape. And why memory can't be unlocked without the proper form. Maybe ancient texts weren't meant to be read line by line, but placed in the right space, in the right light, at the right intersection of time and cycle. Like Tibetan mandalas, which aren't just art. They're cosmic maps only understood when viewed from the center. Like certain petroglyphs that only reveal themselves when the sun hits at just the right angle on just the right day. Like pyramids, which weren't built to be homes, but to resonate with something that doesn't make sound. If that's the case, then symbols aren't just tools. They're mechanisms. Mechanisms meant to awaken something that was programmed to sleep. And this language without words might be the key to the deepest memory. The one every ancient civilization tried to protect. but none were allowed to preserve fully. A record in visual form beyond writing, beyond speech, beyond religion. And maybe when ancient cultures all began writing in a wordless language, it wasn't just a cultural coincidence. It was a desperate final attempt not to be forgotten. If there once was a symbolic language that connected civilizations, the strangest thing isn't that it disappeared, but that it may have survived, and no one understands it anymore. A manuscript that was never lost, never burned, never banned. It's still here, intact, waiting to be read. And in that chilling stillness, it whispers across centuries. Not that the book is dead, but that the reader has forgotten how to live with it. That's the feeling the Voynich manuscript gives. A book no one can translate, no one can imitate, and no one dares to ignore. Among the millions of ancient texts ever discovered, the Voynich manuscript isn't the largest or the oldest, but it's the only one that refuses to reveal itself. Handwritten on vellum, decorated with intricate illustrations that belong to no known taxonomy, plants that don't exist in nature, human bodies distorted into non-anatomical systems, geometric maps that lead nowhere. And most eerie of all, a line of text, real writing created by human hands with patterns, grammar, and lexical cycles. But it's not in any known language. A coded linguistic system so airtight even modern codewreckers, from World War II cryptologists to digital age AIs, have failed to crack it. And in that very impossibility, the Voynich manuscript becomes a symbol of something more. A layer of knowledge sealed shut. Not knowledge that was never known, but knowledge once possessed, now disconnected from our consciousness. What makes Voynich so unsettling isn't what it says. It's the feeling that it does say something. Something complete. Something coherent. But it refuses entry. As if it only opens itself to a certain state of mind. A way of thinking that vanished with the ones who wrote it. People have tried everything. Mathematical decoding. Dead language comparisons. Frequency analysis. Even machine learning models to assign meaning. But every path leads to the same strange circle. A script with rules but no meaning. With structure, but no context. Readable but not understandable. As if the entire book wasn't written to explain anything, but to hide something. A knowledge seal built using the very form of knowledge itself. Yet the illustrations in Voyage aren't abstract art. They show biological order, energy flows, liquid cycles, light movement, stages of bodily transformation, not like anatomy, but like an internal map of the self. Some scholars say it's a medical text. Others call it a magical one. But both feel insufficient. Because if it were just practical knowledge, why hide it in an unreadable language? And if it were just a game, why does it feel like ritual? It may be the Voynich manuscript wasn't made to be read with the eyes, but with a different state of consciousness. A kind of subconscious language where the reader isn't meant to understand each word, but to tune into a certain frequency that unlocks reception. Like ancient rituals that weren't meant to explain but to open gateways. Like chants that didn't mean anything specific, but repeated until the mind hit resonance. Maybe Voynich is the last remaining fragment of a writing tradition that wasn't about understanding, but about activation. In a world where everything is reduced to data, where everything is meant to be decoded, stored, and explained, this one book refuses. It can't be digitized. It can't be analyzed. It won't conform. And in that refusal, it reminds us there once was knowledge that existed outside the modern mind, not held in books, but recorded in states of being, in rituals, in symbols that resist translation. And when that form of knowledge was severed, manuscripts like Voynich didn't disappear. They stayed quietly like a dormant sense that's gone numb but hasn't died. Maybe that's why modern readers look at Voyage and feel something missing. Not because they don't understand it, but because deep down they once did. Like seeing a stranger's face and feeling you've met them before. Like a word on the tip of your tongue you just can't quite say. Like a question that doesn't need an answer but just needs to be remembered. If the Voyage manuscript is a visual text that can't be spoken, then there are other kinds of texts that don't need letters, don't need paper, don't even need symbols. And yet they still exist, still transmitting something that can't be named. These texts live in stone. They aren't arranged by grammar, but by space. They're not read with the eyes but felt through the body through vibration, through a deeper perception where logic stops defining. This is where a text stops being a text and becomes a frequency given form. And among the countless ancient structures we've long mistaken for temples, altars, or primitive observatories, we may have missed the most important thing, that they're speaking, just not in words, but in sound. Stonehenge, Nabtaplier, Gubleet, Chavin, Duantar, Newgrange. All of these sites share one strange trait. They don't just point toward the stars. They respond to sound. When you stand in the right spot and speak at the right pitch, something echoes back. Sharper, more resonant. As if the space itself is answering. That's not coincidence. That's structure. Precision built down to the centimeter. Not for show, but to create a frequency zone where the human body becomes part of a much larger resonant system. At Chavin Duantar in Peru, the ancient tunnels were designed to amplify the sound of conch shells. But the sound wasn't meant to project outward. It was aimed inward. It vibrated through the chest, altered heartbeat rhythms, even triggered visions. There were no words, no messages, but the body remembered the experience like a biological form of writing. At Newgrange in Ireland during the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight enters a tunnel precisely aligned to carry light deep 20 m into the earth. But it's not just about illumination. It's about the moment where light, space, and sound intersect. Because in that exact window, spoken words echo back in frequencies that sound otherworldly. These structures don't tell stories with pictures. They don't explain with sentences. They're energy fields built to transmit information through resonance. Like giant stone instruments. Not made to be looked at, but to activate something in whoever steps inside. Maybe they weren't designed to store content, but to awaken memory in the human body. A kind of memory that doesn't need language. This idea isn't foreign when we look at indigenous traditions, where songs weren't just for singing, but for navigating through forests, where drum beats weren't entertainment, but portals between worlds, where sound wasn't meant to be heard, but to stir something deeper. From ancient Hindu mantras to Tibetan Buddhist chants to Australian Aboriginal song lines. One principle keeps surfacing: that frequency can carry meaning beyond words. And if ancient stone structures weren't meant to be read with eyes, but remembered through ears and skin, then maybe they are libraries. Libraries we no longer know how to access. No passwords. Just stand in the right place. Speak the right tone. Be still. And let the body remember. Maybe that's why ancient civilizations built their sacred sites on the edges of things. Where magnetic lines cross. Where rivers meet mountains. Where sun and moon touch the earth together. Not to worship gods, but to activate resonance. A resonance between the human body, the stone, and the rhythm of the cosmos. In that moment, language is no longer needed because presence itself becomes a sentence. A sentence that doesn't need to be read or understood, only felt. A sentence that reminds you you are inside a much bigger story. And maybe that's why no modern document can replace the feeling of standing inside a silent stone circle. Because there you're not just the reader. You are part of the sentence written in waves. And in that vibration, memory doesn't return through learning. It returns through alignment. In the ancient world, a single word could be a whole story. A shape could be a spell. And a symbol, small, quiet, seemingly simple, could carry within it an entire universe in miniature. When language became frequency, when sound was carved into stone, symbols became the final bridge between memory and the present. No longer text to read, but reference points to recognize. And the most astonishing part is this. Many of the symbols we thought had died with ancient cultures are still alive quietly, powerfully, embedded in the very signs and images we see every day. We just no longer realize what we're looking at. We see a circle with a dot in the center and call it an astronomy symbol, or the emblem of RA, or just a modern logo, never knowing it once meant the sun as divine consciousness. We see wings flanking a central orb and think it's decoration. Unaware the Egyptians used it to represent life force energy rising through the spine. What later traditions would call kundalini. We wear crosses without remembering they existed in many civilizations long before Christianity. Etched into Sumerian reliefs carved into Hindu temples. The swastika, distorted by the 20th century, was once a sacred image of cyclical movement of cosmic flow of the revolving heavens in Jain and Buddhist traditions. The all-seeing eye inside a triangle makes us think of conspiracy theories today. Yet it was once the Eye of Horus, an ancient Egyptian symbol of protection, higher awareness, and seeing truth beyond fragmentation. And that serpent wrapped around a staff, the emblem of modern medicine, wasn't just about health. It symbolized the dual energies of life in balance, drawn from the Veda, Greek philosophy, and the ancient Near East. None of these symbols are new, and no one truly knows where they came from. But they're still here, patient, silent, waiting, as if biding time until they can be seen again. A symbol doesn't need translation like a word. It operates through perception. Like when you see a circle and feel wholeness, a spiral and feel movement, symmetry and feel balance. That's how symbols work. Not through logic, but through the inner structure of experience. And perhaps that's why they were seen as dangerous in so many eras. Because when a symbol is understood correctly, it doesn't just suggest an idea. It activates something inside the one who sees it. Maybe ancient religion wasn't built on belief at all, but on symbol. Every emblem a doorway. Every ritual or way to place that symbol into living space. The entire architecture from temple gates to windows, from corridors to spires, wasn't guiding physical movement. It was guiding meaning. Channeling symbols through light, shadow, wind, and voice. And when symbols lose meaning, the world loses orientation. We see everything, but no longer know what we're seeing. Maybe that's why ancient texts invested so deeply in symbolism rather than explanation. Because they understood words would die, interpretations would shift, but form would endure. And form belongs to no era. Maybe beneath every modern city, beneath the concrete and signs, the old symbols are still there, still functioning. Spiral-shaped roads, churches aligned to stars, coins stamped with gods whose names have simply been changed. And maybe modern people, though we no longer read these signs, are still influenced by them. We walk through them every day. We live in a world coded by them, unaware that we're part of a living script. As maybe what we've lost isn't the symbols themselves, but the ability to recognize that they never left. Some things are preserved in stone, others are passed down through symbols, but a rare few, very rare, have come to us through technology, not myth, not metaphor, but device, matter, geometry, gears. And perhaps that's what makes them the most unsettling of all, because they can't be dismissed as symbols. They exist. Tangible, mechanical, precise, like pieces of knowledge from a different order of civilization, left behind for someone who was never meant to understand what they were holding. Among these anomalies, the Antither mechanism is a crack in the smooth surface of history that can't be patched. There's simply no reason, no historical logic for a gear-driven machine made of bronze capable of calculating lunar and solar cycles, planetary movements, and predicting eclipses to exist in the 1st century BCE. This in a time when even sundials were still rudimentary. So how could a device accurately model the inner workings of the solar system, and more importantly, who needed it and why? The mystery only deepens when we turn to the Piri Reis map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, who admitted it was based on ancient sources whose origins he could not name. The map didn't just get Europe and Africa right. It also included Antarctica ice-free, a detail modern scientists only confirmed in the 20th century using ground-penetrating radar. How could a 500-year-old map show the subglacial terrain of a continent buried under ice for over 6,000 years? The answer may not lie in figuring out who made it, but in accepting that a higher vantage point once existed. A perspective that couldn't have been gained from the ground, that couldn't have been achieved without tools modern science is still trying to replicate. A perspective that didn't belong to the time we've assigned to these artifacts. The Antither mechanism and the Pyrus map aren't myths. They're real. They've been studied, verified, and their very existence casts a long shadow over the story of technological progress we've told ourselves. Because if ancient civilizations once had the capacity for mechanical astronomy, if they once mapped the world with near-orbital accuracy, then where did that knowledge go? Was it lost? Was it taken? Or maybe it was never ours to begin with, because the Antither mechanism isn't the next logical step in ancient engineering. It's an anomaly with no precursors, no successors, as if it was dropped in, placed, then left for time to erode its context. And the Pyrus map, it's not an early draft of modern graphy. It's a record from an observational system we can't identify. As if someone looked down on Earth, not with eyes, but with sensors, not to explore, but to record. And if that's true, then what's missing from history isn't just information. It's perspective. A view that once existed, far more advanced, far more distant, not from the ground, but from memory stored in the sky. It's no coincidence that ancient texts often describe the first teachers as beings who came from above. That might not be a metaphor. It may be a sacred way of remembering something very real, something we've forgotten. We were not the first ones to look down upon the earth. When ancient devices like the Antither mechanism and mysterious maps like Piri Reis reveal technological anomalies that history can't quite explain, a deeper question begins to rise from the sediment of our awareness. If technology once surpassed its supposed era, then what about us? What if human beings with fragmented memory, cracked consciousness, and unpredictable development aren't simply the product of a natural process? What if this body, this genome, this brain is also the result of an intervention that's been erased from the record? If we stop looking at the human genome through a purely biological lens and start seeing it symbolically, it begins to resemble a manuscript copied and recopied through the ages. Some chapters are torn. Some lines repeat. Some symbols mean nothing at all. And some gaps no one dares to fill. Within that genome, over 200 segments of DNA have no clear match with any other known species on Earth. As if lines of alien code were patched in and left to run. Genes like FOXP2, crucial for language and expression, appear suddenly without evolutionary precedent. And perhaps most suspicious of all, the leap in human cognition, language, and symbolic thought happened in an incredibly short window. Too short for natural evolution to make sense of it. If DNA is a form of code, then the human biological past isn't a smooth timeline. It's been interrupted, edited, even debugged like a software system recovering from a critical failure. Some geneticists, when studying the genome as a system, have admitted this structure feels assembled, as if composed from parts that don't share the same origin. Maybe humans weren't the first version. Maybe there were prototypes, biological lines tested, refined, then discarded. And thus, we may be the latest iteration. And in ancient texts, this idea isn't hidden. It's right there. In Summa, humans were molded from clay, but had to be infused with the essence of the gods to become intelligent enough to follow orders. In the Vedic scriptures, the Das and Asuras shaped physical matter using light and vibration, creating beings able to hold spirit but without memory. In Genesis, the first human only became alive when the breath of life was blown into his nostrils. Not a biological act, but a form of conscious programming to strip away the myth. And these stories start to read like symbolic biological reports. Not acts of divine love, but experiments by cosmic engineers. The goal: a being both autonomous and controllable. A creature capable of memory but with limited access. Capable of awareness but only within preset boundaries. A form with the potential for godhood, but installed with a forgetting mechanism so powerful it never realizes what it carries inside. And if that's true, then humanity's memory wasn't just stolen from the outside. It was locked from within. Which means every ancient text, every ritual, every sacred geometry, every chant, every symbol might be a key scattered across the world, waiting like fragments of lost code, ready to align and unlock a gate that's been closed since before we understood what we are. Maybe true evolution doesn't come from racing toward the future. Maybe it comes from going back, reassembling the code fragments hidden in our DNA, the compressed symbols buried deep in the subconscious. And if that day comes, the day we reach the first line of our own genetic script, then the question, where did we come from, won't be a question anymore. It will be an answer. Because in that moment, we'll stop seeing the body as a biological machine and start reading it as a living manuscript. Each cell a symbol. Each strand of DNA a sentence. And this very life, the opening chapter of a book that once had half its pages torn away. If the human genome is an unfinished manuscript, then ancient civilizations weren't just the first readers. They may have witnessed the moment it was first written. And among all the cultures that left behind written records, not just myth, but systematic documentation, no place stands out more than the land between two rivers, Sumer. There in thousands of clay tablets inscribed with ununiform, lies a body of texts that blend mythology and machinery, religion and biology. A place where the creation of humanity isn't described as a miracle, but as a technical operation carried out by named beings with roles, facilities, and objectives. At the center of it all is one name: Enki. Unlike the supreme gods of later religions, Enki doesn't embody absolute power. He doesn't sit on high punishing or rewarding. Enki is described as an engineer, a designer, someone who manipulates living matter, not to create life from nothing but to modify what already exists. In the Atrahasis and other tablets, Enki is the one who responds to the rebellion of the lower-tier Anunnaki, overworked and demanding relief. The solution doesn't come through punishment or divine wrath. It comes from a decision to build something new, the human being. And the texts lay out that process in striking detail, so precise it leaves modern readers unsettled. There's no magic, no divine spark, just experimentation. Clay mixed with the essence of the gods. 14 goddesses assigned to carry the test subjects. Prototypes that failed. Some couldn't speak. Some couldn't survive. Some couldn't reproduce. Failure after failure until finally a functioning being was born. Not because it was destined, but because the sequence of errors was corrected. Adu, the first human. Here, humanity isn't a grand act of divine creation. It's the first successful result of a biological trial. Even more intriguing, the text emphasizes how Enki modified Adamu to restrict his reproductive and cognitive abilities. A built-in form of control. Only when Enki improved the next version did human multiplication begin. And in that moment, we stop seeing a god and start seeing a programmer. A bioengineer cloaked in myth. What makes these Sumerian records so unique isn't just what they say. It's how they say it. The tone is clinical, administrative, non-symbolic. Enki isn't a savior. He's the one providing a technological solution to a labor shortage. And that solution was deployed using genetic components through extracting living parts from a god's body. An image eerily close to DNA sampling. No one in the text calls it a miracle. They call it work. And that forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about mythology. What if it isn't sacred legend at all, but technological memory told in the only language ancient humanity still understood? So, then Enki isn't a spiritual deity. He's a symbol of an intelligence that once manipulated biology, that once restructured a species, and left traces of that work in the very way humans understand themselves. It's no coincidence that so many ancient cultures refer to their ancestors as those made from combination, or as bearers of the blood of the sky. These poetic phrases might actually be remnants of something real. A memory that humans didn't arrive through a smooth chain of evolution, but through a decision. And if there was a decision, then someone had to make it. And if someone made it, there had to be a reason. And if that reason no longer exists in the written texts, maybe it still exists inside us in unread portions of our genome, in limits no one can explain, and in the quiet lingering sense that we were something else before we became human. If the creation of humans was the result of a technological intervention later mythologized, then finding tools that defy the limits of their time shouldn't come as a surprise. These objects don't arrive in flashes of light. They don't come wrapped in legends. They're not found in temples or sacred texts. More often, they lie quietly buried in stone, embedded in strata where metal supposedly had no place. And yet it's that very silence that makes them shatter history. Because in the middle of the Stone Age, when humanity was supposedly just learning to chip flint, build fires, and hunt, there appear things like alloyed iron gears, precision threaded shafts, or hollowed quartz crystals pierced with methods we still can't explain. No timeline can fully account for that. The breath of metal. It sounds poetic, but it's something you can touch. metal tools with astonishing hardness, alloy compositions unknown in nature, and cuts so precise they challenge even modern machining. These have been found scattered across the world. A hammer encased in rock over 100 million years old, discovered in Texas. A cylindrical metal tube unearthed in France, deep in rock layers dating back 65 million years. A near-perfect metal sphere from South Africa etched with parallel grooves like it was turned on a CNC lathe long before humans, according to evolutionary theory, even existed. They're called out of place artifacts. But maybe what's out of place isn't the artifact. It's our timeline. The reason these artifacts are ignored or worse ridiculed has less to do with science and more to do with fear. Because if we accept that someone once worked with metal, crafted precision tools, understood crystal structure, and left behind cuts created by extreme frequencies or unimaginable heat, then our entire model of human technological progress has to be rewritten. And not just from the Bronze Age or Iron Age, but from a missing chapter. A chapter where humans weren't the first to pick up a tool. So the question isn't who made these things, it's why are we not allowed to talk about them? Maybe because to face these artifacts is to face the truth that other hands have shaped this world before us, and if we place those hands on the same map as Enki and the ancient engineer gods, they stop looking like metaphors. They may have been real, not as deities to be worshipped, but as beings who practiced technique. They didn't need altars. They needed labs. They didn't want believers. They needed tools. And those tools, for reasons unknown, were left behind, buried, forgotten, but still here, resting, waiting, refusing to dissolve into time. Maybe that's why across every ancient culture, metal was always sacred. Copper, gold, meteoric iron. They weren't just precious. They were powerful. Not because of their rarity, but because they carried a residual energy from a forgotten age. A physical memory. One that can't be translated, but can be felt. When you see an impossible cut, touch an unexplainable alloy, or stand before a metallic object lodged in stone so undeniably real no forger could ever fake it. The breath of metal makes no sound, but it resonates with a quiet message that maybe humanity came after someone and what we think of as the beginning and might just be a system reboot on an operating platform that was running long before we knew how to ask. If tools that shouldn't exist are still buried in stone, then what's even more unsettling is that the traces that shouldn't exist might be inside us. No need for excavation. No need for radar. Just a strand of DNA is enough to show that human history didn't flow like a clean evolutionary stream, but twisted, interrupted, and layered with hidden forks, erased jumps, and bloodlines from places no one dares to name. And sometimes within the spirals of our genetic code, we don't find mutations. We find memories. Biological echoes of a lineage that may not have been entirely human. For years, Neanderthals and Denisovans were dismissed as evolutionary footnotes, dead-end species, outliers in the story of Homo sapiens. But when genetic science caught up and comparison became possible at the molecular level, it turned out they never left. Not completely. They're still here. Not as species, but as fingerprints in our blood. Europeans carry between 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan genes. And these fragments aren't meaningless. Some impact the immune system. Some affect the nervous system. And some still can't be explained at all. What does that mean? That humanity isn't a pure species. We are a hybrid structure. A genetic collage woven from multiple layers, directions, and intelligent life forms. And while modern science has only begun to trace the ancestral lines we've dug up from the earth, ancient texts have long spoken of others. beings never named in our modern language. Giants. Children of the gods. Those who came from the sky. Maybe not mere myth, but metaphors for races that once lived alongside us or within us. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, fallen angels, take human wives and give birth to the Nephilim, beings great in strength, intellect, and stature. The Greeks told of the Titans and of gods who had children with mortals. In India, the Mahabharata describes half-divine, half-human races living among ancient citadels. And in Central America, the Maya claimed humanity wasn't created once, but in several failed versions before the one we know. Why does nearly every ancient culture echo the same theme? That humanity wasn't alone in the beginning. Could it be that at some point this planet was a convergence point? A crossroads of many life forms, many intelligent species, and the memory of that meeting was buried deep within our bloodline. A kind of silent zone in our genome. Regions we don't understand, but which still quietly operate, powering the bodies of billions to this very day. Even beyond DNA in our cultural traditions, the obsession with a different bloodline is everywhere. Egyptian pharaohs claimed descent from Ra. European royal houses whispered of blood from the stars. Japanese emperors traced their line to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. The Dune people of Africa told of ancestors from the Sirius system. Maybe this wasn't just myth wrapped in ritual. Maybe it was memory compressed into ceremony, story, and lineage too sacred or too dangerous to name directly. And if a non-human bloodline was ever grafted into us, like a conscious implant, it may still be there in our bursts of unexplainable creativity, in that strange sense of not fully belonging to this world, in the longing we feel toward the stars, something no biological theory has ever accounted for. And most of all, in the one question we've never been allowed to ask out loud: why is humanity the only species on Earth that knows it exists? If strange strands of DNA lead back to a veiled origin, then there's one ancient body of text that never shied away from naming it directly. No metaphors, no softening through symbols, just a clear, unsettling assertion. There were once beings born of both human and something else. Not gods, not demons, but the product of a deliberate act. An experiment that wasn't supposed to happen, but did. And its aftermath may not just echo through religious memory. It may still linger within our bodies and in our souls. In the Book of Enoch, these beings are named without hesitation, but did. And its aftermath may not just echo through religious memory. It may still linger within our bodies and in our souls. In the Book of Enoch, these beings are named without hesitation. Nephilim. They are not human, not fully divine. They are the offspring of the Watchers, celestial beings assigned to guard the heavens who took daughters of men as wives. And the children born of these unions were unstable. Giants. Brilliant. Powerful. But undisciplined. They obeyed no laws of earth or sky. They didn't fit into the cosmic order. They disrupted it. And what's most shocking is that their birth was not a one-off event. It was a coordinated, widespread operation happening everywhere all at once. Enoch doesn't write like a prophet. He writes like a recorder. Someone documenting a reality. And in that reality, the Nephilim became a serious problem. Not just because of their strength, but because of their awareness. They disobeyed. But they knew. They didn't belong to heaven. But they understood its laws. And that made them a threat. Not to humanity, but to the very architects of order itself. In the text, a heavenly council is called. And the decision isn't to punish individuals. It's to wipe the slate clean. A full reset. A great flood. Not just to cleanse the earth, but to bury the evidence of a genetic intervention gone too far. The Watchers are imprisoned beneath the earth. The hybrid children are destroyed. Humanity is rebuilt from a purified line. This time with no mixing. No divine knowledge. Only the silent echo of something that once was. What baffles modern scholars is how similar stories appear outside the Hebrew tradition. In India, the Mahabharata tells of demigods born from devas through ritual and light. Children of great purpose who also spark wars of extinction. In Greek myth, heroes like Heracles, Perseus, Achilles, they're all hybrids born of divine and mortal union. Stronger than men, but doomed to tragedy. In South America, Incan legends speak of giants from the sky who took native daughters as wives and bore children that could not truly belong to either world. Perhaps these aren't just myths. Perhaps they're humanity's way of preserving the memory of a forbidden merging. A biological experiment abandoned or judged too dangerous to continue. And because it was interrupted, what remains is scattered, fragmented, like misaligned strands of DNA. Like broken myths passed down in whispers. Like oversized bones that are discovered, then mysteriously disappear from official records. And if such beings ever did walk this earth, then where are their descendants now? Maybe they're not somewhere else. Maybe they don't need to exist as a separate race. Maybe all it takes is a trace. One drop of blood. One sliver of memory. One strand of hybrid DNA embedded within the human genome. Just enough to affect how someone feels. How they remember things no one ever taught them. Just enough to create people who feel like they don't quite belong. People who carry a memory with no source. People who don't fit in but see the world others can't bear to look at. And if there really was such a union between sky and earth, between biology and awareness, then it may be the missing piece in our origin story. A piece that was erased from textbooks, replaced with metaphors buried beneath historical sediment. But memory once etched into blood doesn't disappear. It lingers. It returns like a quiet itch in the back of the mind. Like a distant echo. Like a question no one dares answer. Are we entirely us? Or are we the remnant of something that was never meant to survive? If the existence of the Nephilim was the consequence of a hybridization beyond what was ever meant to be allowed, then the cost wasn't just the destruction of those unstable offspring. It was the erasure of the entire framework that enabled them. Not the fall of a single species, but the collapse of an entire cycle of consciousness. And the way that destruction was recorded wasn't through images of war or downfall, but through one of the most primal symbols of all. Water. Not a natural disaster, but an act. A planetary scale formatting event. In the Book of Enoch, the Great Flood doesn't come as blind divine rage, but as a strategic decision to wipe the earth clean, imprison the fallen, and return humanity to a controlled beginning. The same theme appears in the Bible with Noah. Not chosen for greatness, but for compatibility. Pure-blooded, obedient, and quiet enough not to ask why. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is warned by Enki of a coming flood, not born of wrath, but to restore the correct order. In India, the god Vishnu appears as the fish Matsya to guide Manu and the seed of life through rising waters. In Mesoamerican traditions, the flood is told as one of several resets after failed creations made of clay, of wood, of maize. Across cultures, languages and myths, the message remains constant. The world was not reset by accident. It was chosen. a deliberate reprogramming of Earth itself. Water no longer as cleanser but as logic blade. Everything returned to a blank slate. And from there, a new humanity was rebuilt with less memory, less ability, and above all, less access to the levels of consciousness that had been disconnected. It's no coincidence that in many ancient cultures, the memory of the flood isn't told with rage, but with something stranger. A quiet sense that humans themselves knew they had gone too far. A remorse not spoken aloud. A collective feeling that something within the former self exceeded its limits, and that starting over was inevitable. The death of the pre-flood civilization wasn't a tragedy. It was a forced safeguard to stop the system from crashing entirely. And if we read ancient texts closely, we begin to see it wasn't just the plants, animals, and knowledge that were lost. A portion of memory was severed. That disconnection is encoded in symbols. Languages divided. Symbols forgotten. Knowledge turned into legend. And survivors unable to access the old system. That's when texts stop being operating manuals and become hints. When rituals stop being technologies and become simulated memories of how the world was once governed. If the Great Flood was a programming tool, then post-flood humanity was a limited version. A new cognitive architecture with stricter firewalls, built-in moral encryption, and self-limiting systems designed to prevent a repeat of the critical error. And this isn't just the belief of the ancients. It's a foundational feeling buried in the modern human psyche. The fear of going too far. The fragmentation of knowledge. The haunting sense that something within us was once stronger, deeper, wider, but was locked away. When the waters of the Great Flood receded, it wasn't just dry land that emerged. The first thing to rise was silence. A kind of silence. Not born from devastation, but from the weight of knowing too much and no longer being able to speak it. And within that silence, a group stepped forward, not as founders, but as remembers. They didn't carry knowledge in books. They carried fragments of biological code that still remembered the old operating system. They didn't relearn. They restructured, not to restore what was lost, but to make it survivable in a world that could no longer bear the truth of what had come before. Across traditions, traces of these people remain. In Egypt, they are the godlike figures such as Thoth, who recorded the memory of the old world and taught humans to read the cycles again. In Sumer, they are the able beings from Eridu, who carried the tablets of destiny. In China, they appear as sages like Fukui and Nua, described as those who reassembled the sky from broken pieces. In the Andes, they are embodied by Viracocha, who walks the mountains after the flood, teaching humans to build, to plant, and to remember through stone. They don't come from dynasties. They appear between cycles. Not gods, not kings, but intermediaries. Not holders of power, but of memory. And what they share in common is this. They never reveal everything they knew. They choose to rebuild from a different foundation. Simpler, more abstract, and above all, safer. No longer transmitting raw knowledge, but encoding it through symbols, through architecture, through ritual. Knowledge wasn't passed by speech anymore, but by pattern, in the shapes of temples, in the rhythm of time, in the placement of stars, because they understood the post-flood world could no longer withstand naked truth. The survivors couldn't run the old program, like a weakened machine unable to process its former software. Post-reset, humanity needed a new system, lighter, slower, with less memory and restricted access. So instead of telling what once happened, They built symbolic models. Celestial calendars no longer synchronized human consciousness. They became farming rituals. Pyramids no longer resonated as machines. They became tombs. Ceremonies no longer opened gateways. They became beliefs. Everything was remade, but in forms the world could endure. A deliberately compressed system of knowledge handed over to a species that had forgotten it once knew. And from this paradox was born. Humanity now lives surrounded by symbols without realizing those symbols are remnants of a forgotten system. We repeat the image of the tree of life, not knowing it was once a diagram of biological energy. We build cities aligned with stars, but no longer understand what alignment means. We tell myths of gods, not realizing they were once representations of universal forces once woven into human consciousness. Those who held the memory, maybe they disappeared, or maybe they dissolved into the bloodlines, scattered among the unremarkable, still carrying the code. Maybe they were the ancient shamans, the stargazers, the stone temple scribes. Or maybe they were the heretics condemned for speaking truths their era could not bear. But however they existed, they were the quiet witnesses of a knowledge that was once whole, then narrowed, then blurred, not erased with violence, but restructured from within. And maybe that's why in every esoteric tradition there's always a whisper of a promise that one day knowledge will return. Not through discovery, but through activation. Not by reading more, but by remembering differently. By looking at what we've always known and seeing what was never said aloud. After knowledge was restructured in the wake of the Great Flood, those who remember didn't speak of time as a straight line, but as a spiral. In the surviving ancient texts, time was never described as something that simply flows forward. It was always a wheel, a cycle, a vast breadth of the cosmos where every beginning is also a return. And that idea wasn't poetic metaphor. It was the very foundation of how the ancients thought time as ordered repetition, not as blind progression. In the Rig Veda, time is divided into yugas, great epochs, each with distinct characteristics, ending with collapse and restarting like the seasons turning or stars shifting in the sky. In Maya tradition, the long count calendar doesn't tally passing years. It tracks epochs like a system logging how many times the operating program has been reset. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Zepi the first time wasn't a past event, but a sacred pattern that could be reactivated through ritual and architecture. In China, the cyclical system wasn't just for marking age. It was a cosmic alignment tool encoding human events into a rhythm of heavenly and earthly motion. All of these temporal systems, when compared, point to one truth. The ancients weren't trying to measure time. They were trying to synchronize with it. They built temples aligned with the sun at seasonal transitions. They held ceremonies on days when the sky and earth axes aligned. They passed down knowledge not through theory but through living in rhythm because they believed only when one acts in harmony with the right moment does the gateway of memory open. In such a view, time doesn't pass, it returns. Modern science still sees time as linear, but quantum physics is beginning to falter in front of anomalies. Fragments of reality where past and future seem to coexist. A particle can appear in two places at once. An event can be altered by the observation that happens after it. This is no longer mysticism. It is physics slowly retracing what the ancients may have already known. The universe does not run in straight lines, but in recursive patterns. In such a universe, truth doesn't sit at the end of the road. It reveals itself within the loop. And what has been hidden for thousands of years may not be lost in content but in our misdef. Because if we are taught that everything only moves forward, then ancient warnings of the return moment, the sacred cycle, The day the gate reopens are dismissed as nonsense. But if time is a spiral, then every cycle is a chance to recover what was blurred. It's no coincidence that across so many indigenous traditions, certain windows are known as open periods. When the veil between worlds thins, when forgotten knowledge can resurface, when memory systems can be reactivated like software awaiting an update. And if this is true, then living out of sync with the cycles, severing from cosmic rhythm, abandoning sacred agriculture, rejecting geometric alignments isn't just cultural loss. It is a disruption of the memory encoding system of the universe. Maybe that's why at the heart of every ancient civilization, there is always a calendar, not to mark dates, but to locate the soul in a larger structure. Each human life is a cog in the grand wheel of time. And if we find the rhythm again, it's not just the past that returns. We return to, not as travelers moving through time, but as beings inside time, remembering what the body was always programmed never to fully forget. When time is no longer a straight line, but a cycle, and when memory isn't held solely by words, but by rhythm, by location, by symbol, a new question begins to surface. Could there be a kind of knowledge that needs no form at all? One that isn't written in letters, carved into stone, encoded in genes, or stored in cells, but instead is transmitted through something else entirely. Light, vibration, silence, awareness. And if such a knowledge exists, what texts have ever dared to describe it? When all forms of expression begin to dissolve, perhaps among all the ancient repositories of human thought, no tradition has dared go further than Buddhism in asking the ultimate question: what is truly real? It does not begin with events. It does not center around deities. It does not focus on creation. Buddhism turns away from the world of form and asks what is it that knows, and that question posed not to be answered but to be lived becomes the threshold into a different kind of text. A kind of scripture not meant to be read but to be synchronized with. In the Avatamsaka Sutra flower ornament scripture, the world is described as a net of interpenetrating realities with no fixed center, where each thing is itself yet simultaneously reflects the whole. A speck of dust contains the universe. A single moment opens into infinite aeons. There is no beginning. No end. Time, space, and awareness are not separate, but layers of a single unfolding field. And strikingly, the text doesn't argue or explain. It appears. The reader is not asked to understand it, but to enter a state of seeing things as they truly are. Not through analysis, but through the silence of presence. Other texts like the Prayaparita Sutras, the Lankavatara Sutra, or the Perfect Enlightenment Sutra do not aim to give knowledge. They aim to dismantle the frameworks of perception. They offer no new beliefs but unravel the illusions built around the old ones, peeling away layer after layer of conceptual language, returning to the ground state, a mind unerred. In that state, what remains is not doctrine, but the light of direct knowing, a kind of language without sound, without messenger, without grammar, but capable of transmitting the full depth of the cosmos, if the receiver is still enough to let it pass through unaltered. This isn't philosophy. It's a form of technical instruction for a mode of knowing that doesn't belong to the brain. A transmission not of vocabulary, but of frequencies of awareness. Like the ring of a bell at the right moment calling someone back into the present. Like a single gaze filled with compassion, dissolving a lifetime of resentment. Like the ancient practitioners in mountain caves who didn't learn anything new but saw everything because they no longer needed to name the world. In Vajrayana and Tantric Buddhism, Transmission often doesn't come through teachings but through mudra, a look, a gesture, a subtle surge of energy capable of burning through the veil between transmitter and receiver. In those moments, words are unnecessary. Knowledge doesn't need to travel. It resonates instantly, aligning with the deepest layers of the recipient like two waves touching at just the right frequency. It's not something you can explain, but it can flip the structure of a person's being entirely. If today's world is locked in the confines of limited language, then these metaphysical texts don't attempt to break the limits through content. They do the opposite. They reawaken a form of transmission that needs no content. A form our distant ancestors may have once lived with naturally. A form those keepers of memory after the flood might have fully understood. Choosing to encode knowledge into symbols, spirals, and rituals, not because they didn't know how to write, but because they knew writing wasn't enough. That's likely why the deepest scriptures aren't meant to be studied but abided in. Not discussed, but dwelt with. And maybe the ancient practitioners, those who sat in silence, faced cliff walls, closed their eyes, and yet saw, spoke no words, and yet caused others to awaken. They are the final living texts of a time when knowledge needed no books. A time when light was not just a physical phenomenon, but a language spoken between layers of existence that have never been given names. Perhaps those living texts, the silent practitioners who serve as lanterns in the dark, are only fragments of something far greater. A system where knowledge isn't written down, but witnessed. A system that doesn't rely on language or symbols, but on the sheer presence of awareness itself. Because when knowledge stops being information to be passed down and becomes synchronization between layers of consciousness, the question shifts from who said what to who saw it. Who is it that records every ripple in existence? Not with ink, not with speech, not with words at all, yet still preserves everything. This is where we step into another type of scripture. Not one of teachings, but of vision. Not of sermons, but of silence. A realm of beings who are neither gods nor humans, but always present like fixed points of awareness embedded within the architecture of the cosmos. They don't come to change the world with force, but to ensure that nothing goes unwitnessed. And because it is seen, cannot be forgotten. Among them, perhaps the most haunting figure is Enoch, a human among humans, yet one who was called up into a network that no longer belonged to Earth. In the Book of Enoch, a text omitted from the biblical canon, but preserved within Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, he does not die. He is taken from the earth and transformed into Metatron, not entirely human, not quite divine, but a living recording system, a silent witness to the unfolding of all things. Metatron does nothing, yet he knows everything, not because he was taught, but because he sees. And in the apocalyptic texts, this act of seeing is not mere observation. It is inscription into reality itself. A watcher does not simply know. Their awareness locks the event into existence, like a vibrating frequency that becomes fixed the moment it is observed, stored, synchronized into the deeper architecture where memory is no longer personal, but cosmic. Figures like Enoch aren't unique. In Gnostic tradition, Daeons, beings of light from the primal realm of awareness, don't create. They witness and harmonize. They never speak, but their presence reflects all distortion instantly into higher levels. In Mahayana Buddhism, there are bodhisattvas who don't preach but see everything like Muningsri or Mahavajrana. Entities who grant no blessings, issue no punishments, but mirror every action so clearly. All illusion falls away in their gaze. Perhaps these aren't just mythological tropes. Perhaps they are remnants of an ancient memory, of a universal network of observation, one that ensures the game never drifts too far from its intended structure. And sometimes these watchers do more than witness. They descend not to save, but to correct, to realign a dissonant point, to bring a being back into its proper frequency. Not like a savior but like a technician of balance. And what's remarkable is this. They never appear without cause. Every descent of an angel in ancient texts, Gabriel in Hebrew tradition, the fiery angels in the Book of Enoch, the beings of light in Gnostic writings, is always tied to a programming mission. They arrive when order collapses, when a group is about to interfere too deeply, when humanity is on the verge of remembering something before its time, when synchronization points are lost, when a gate is about to open at the wrong frequency, and they only intervene as much as needed, then vanish, leaving behind a half-luminous, half-forgotten impression humanity has long called by one word: revelation. Maybe that's why in nearly every culture, no matter the mythology, we find the recurring image of a being from the light who descends, says little, stays briefly, and leaves behind a code, a warning, a celestial map, a subtle command, and then departs, leaving humans to decide, will we remember, or will we repeat? And maybe they're still watching, not from the sky, but from within the structure of our own consciousness, a layer we cannot access, but can feel. Presence that doesn't judge, doesn't explain, just knows, like the gaze of Metatron, silent, transparent. But when we dare to face it deeply enough, everything we've tried to hide becomes impossible to deny. Ancient memory doesn't just tell stories of witnesses. It also speaks of those who handed down models. They didn't leave behind philosophies. They didn't establish religions. They didn't found schools in any modern sense. They didn't teach literacy. They taught how to place the first stone. They didn't tell us what to believe. They taught us how to build the world from what seemed like purely physical things. How to plant. How to divide land. How to align a temple's axis with the stars. How to design irrigation channels that flowed in sync with the moon. And yet, these teachings carried a level of precision and astronomical, mathematical, and geometric depth that human civilizations wouldn't begin to match for thousands of years. These first teachers may not have been human. Not a single ancient civilization claims to be the beginning. Ancient Egypt referred to its golden age as Zepi, the first time when the gods still walked among men. The Sumerians spoke of the Apkallu, 7 sages from Eridu who taught humans every art from astronomy to engineering, then withdrew into the deep sea. The Maya spoke of creator teachers who tried and failed to make humans several times, but once successful taught them how to build cities, track time, and chart the heavens. In Peru, the Inca honored Viracha, a bearded man who emerged after the flood, walked silently through the Andes, rebuilding the world with stone, with geometry, and then vanished into the mist. They didn't stay. They didn't found dynasties. They left no bloodlines. And yet, wherever they were remembered, the structures they left behind were always foundational. Pyramids, observatories, irrigation systems, cities aligned with constellations, as if their first mission was not to rule, but to realign the frequency of space so humans could live in a resonant environment, one that could help them remember what had been blurred. They didn't inspire. They structured. And that's what makes them so different from the divine figures of modern religions. They didn't bless. They didn't judge. They came, established a symbolic and physical architecture, and left like someone fixing the antenna on a misaligned receiver so that the machine could once again function in its original mode. Seen from this perspective, ancient monuments aren't temples. They're lessons encoded in matter. They are wordless libraries, cognitive diagrams in stone, maps of relationships between the sun, humanity, water, consciousness, and planetary resonance. Perhaps this is why modern eyes don't understand them, because they don't transmit meaning. They emit a field, a spatial design meant to activate something dormant in the human structure itself. And if someone once knew how to build such structures, they couldn't have come from a primitive culture. They couldn't have relied on stone and axe alone. They would have needed a star map spanning millennia, tools to measure the axial tilt of Earth, a deep understanding of how sound resonates within local materials. They must have come from somewhere else. Not necessarily another planet, but certainly another frame of consciousness. Perhaps they didn't arrive in ships. Perhaps they arrived through resonance, appearing at moments in history when humanity was quiet enough to hear. They didn't bring weapons. They brought schematics. They didn't impose beliefs. They reminded. And because of that, they needed no names. Only patterns left to echo inside the consciousness of those who would live among them generation after generation. And when those patterns were broken, distorted, forgotten, or turned into religion for profit, these beings would simply disappear quietly as they came. No rebuke, because they didn't do it to be remembered. They did it to help the system realign with the deepest memory of the cosmos. Maybe these first teachers didn't create humanity, but they may have been the last ones who remembered why humanity was created at all. When knowledge is passed down, not through language, but through structure, then the first to bridge the sacred blueprint into physical form wasn't a philosopher, but a builder. One who didn't need to write, didn't need to preach, but simply knew how to place the first stone at the right moment, in the right direction, in the right resonance. And once the structure came into being, it was never just shelter. It became a silent school where no one teaches, but anyone can learn if they know where to stand and when to be still. Long before the pyramids of Egypt, before the stone temples of Angkor, Teotihuacan or Baalbek, there were foundations that emerged quietly as if from nowhere. No signs of primitive construction techniques, no leftover tools, no linear evolution. They appear like the first pages torn from an ancient book without prologue. Gopal Tepe, dating back over 11,000 years, is one such place, with its T-shaped stone pillars carved with animals, its star-aligned circular layouts, and no sign of habitation around it. It wasn't a dwelling. It was a structure of memory. Sumerian texts, though not explicitly referencing Jubeklit, speak of times before the Age of Kings when builders were chosen by the word of the heavens and worked in silence. In Egypt, the Turin Canon lists divine dynasties stretching tens of thousands of years before the first pharaohs. Names without biographies, without tombs, without descendants. They weren't worshipped. They were simply remembered as the ones who began something. The Inca never claimed credit for the largest stoneworks in the Andes. They simply said, "They were here when we arrived." Modern archaeology, faced with flawlessly cut stones fitted so tightly that not even a blade can slip between them, often asks, what tools did they use? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question is, what were they doing? Perhaps these structures aren't mere feats of engineering, but vessels for operating instructions, like stone machines that run not on mechanics, but on presence, of shape, of sound, of light, moving through at the exact right time and angle. And maybe that's why the first builders left no names. 'Cause they didn't need to be remembered. What needed remembering was the pattern, the structure, the hidden function. They didn't take credit. They designed their work so that the structure itself would remember the original intent. And whenever someone steps inside, stands in the right spot, speaks the right frequency, the system activates with no operator required. This may explain why in many ancient traditions, building a temple was never a mere physical task. It was a ritual, a transmission, a restoration of something that had once been lost, sometimes lost to memory, sometimes to time, but always preserved in sacred form. A design passed not through books, but through intuition, through dreams, through a deep knowing in the bones. I have known this before. Perhaps the first builders didn't see themselves as engineers. And stone, not just material, but a page. Each structure a sentence never written down. And every stone placed one more line in a physical book, left behind for a generation with no access to ancient language. No memory of old gods. But who would feel something so precise, so right that they wouldn't be able to explain it? If the first builders left behind no names but patterns, then what they passed on wasn't architecture. It was frequency, embodied in form. Every stone slab, every corner, every corridor, every axis of symmetry was not placed for visual harmony, but for one precise purpose: resonance. Not just sound, not even light, but the resonance between human consciousness and geometric fields. A form of writing that doesn't need to be read, yet still transforms anyone who steps inside, whether they understand it or not. From the Giza pyramids to the observatory at Chichen, from Stonehenge to Borobudur, one thing never changes. These structures don't just exist. They echo. The central chambers produce strange acoustic effects. A whisper travels tens of meters. In some places, tapping the stone causes the entire space to vibrate like a resonant chamber. Modern people call it physics. But the ancients didn't build temples for echoes. They built them to activate a deeper perceptual field where language was no longer needed because frequency had taken its place. Sacred geometry, often dismissed as symbolic decoration, was never merely symbolic. It was a code system written in shape. Ratios like phi1, 618, pi, the Fibonacci sequence, or symmetrical polygons weren't for aesthetics. They were grammar in forms like six-pointed stars. Interlocking circles or spirals weren't drawn for beauty. They carried commands, and only when one stood in the right place, still in the right moment and receptive in the right state, could consciousness decode them. In some Egyptian temples, special resonance chambers have been found where sound is amplified and reflected in unnerving precision. At Angkor Wat, the entire complex is laid out like a cosmic map with corridors that act as time corridors where walking is not just movement. It's a journey through a coded cycle. In ancient caves like Chavín de Want in Peru, the walls are blank, but the tunnel design channels conch shell blasts into audio illusions, sounds that awaken the very structure of space itself. Dormant for millennia, these places teach nothing in the modern sense. But those who pass through them often feel different afterward. Not because they understood, but because their bodies resonated. Perhaps the ancients didn't need schools because each temple was a classroom. Every well aligned with the solstice was a lesson. Every vaulted ceiling built to the cycle of the moon was a blackboard. They didn't learn the way we think of learning. They restructured their biology by living inside precise vibrational systems. That may be why in many ancient cultures, music was not art. It was a knowledge tool. A Sanskrit chant wasn't just prayer. It was a vibrational directive to align inner pathways. A Tibetan mantra didn't describe the world. It framed a resonance pattern for the inner world to emerge. In such a context, the word is no longer for expression. It is a key. And when that key is uttered correctly, the entire space shifts. This is true. Then perhaps the oldest texts of humanity aren't stored in books. They're embedded in temple structures, in drum rhythms, in floor geometry, in the echo between carved stone columns. No need to print. No need to carve. Just stand there in stillness and let the space read you back. And in that moment, the visitor realizes they're not reading knowledge. They're being rewritten. Beyond the resonant stone pillars. Beyond temples built like crystallized symphonies. Beyond the spaces where one is rewritten by vibration alone. A strange and recurring image begins to surface across nearly every ancient civilization. The human-shaped being of light. Not a god in the commanding sense. Not a human in the biological sense. But something else. An interface. A temporary structure made visible. Designed to transmit a level of awareness beyond the reach of language. In these figures, light having already become sound geometry and resonance is now translated into a form that can be encountered across ancient religions from Egypt to India. From Mesopotamia to the Andes. The earliest gods always appeared humanoid, but never entirely human. They were taller, brighter, winged, many-armed, lion-faced, hawk-eyed, blue-skinned, or glowing like metal. They spoke not with words but with light. They arrived and departed in cycles. They had no fixed bodice. And critically, they only appeared when the world had fallen out of rhythm. As if they didn't live here. But only manifested when reality needed recalibration. In Egypt, Thoth with the ibis head was not just a random deity. He was the scribe, the remember, the one who maintained cosmic balance by keeping the code alive. In India, Vishnu takes on avatars, incarnations of man, beast or light whenever the world strays too far from Dharma. In Tibetan tradition, Bodhisattvas don't come to rescue but to mirror. Their presence reveals the original pattern of consciousness within the observer. They don't seek worship. They exist to remind. What's uncanny is that all of these figures, despite differing names, perform the same task. They emerge in chaos to model coherence. They don't fight. They don't punish. They arrive at the right frequency. And their mere presence causes everything to begin resynchronizing. Not through power. Through resonance. Like tuning a loose string. Not by force. But by placing it next to one already in tune. Perhaps that's why ancient statues of gods always conform to strict, deliberate forms. Upright posture. Hand gestures pointing to exact directions. Seated on lotus thrones encircled by flames holding symbols. These weren't artistic choices. They were schematics. These light forms weren't personalities, but biological diagrams of a being fully aligned. Every hand a behavior. Every eye a gateway. Every finger a code. The whole body a map back to a state of awareness that humanity once had and then lost. At its deepest level, ancient religion may not have been belief at all. It may have been a system for transmitting knowledge through personified geometry. When light could no longer stop to teach, it appeared as form. A body. A voice. A breath just close enough to see. Just distant enough not to be trapped in words. And once the message was delivered, the light being vanished. Not dying, but deactivating the form, like a signal ending after the transmission is complete. If that's true, then the first gods may not have created humanity. They were models appearing only to reboot the corrupted code. Not originators, but interfaces. Not creators, but correctors. They were temporary embodiment of light deployed to return human civilization to its proper rhythm. Then quietly withdrawn. No need for worship. No need for stone statues. Just a simple goal. Restore the pattern in behavior. In order. In how humans saw themselves as the clearest, most luminous version of who they could be. And maybe the light beings never left. Maybe they still exist. Not in the sky, but within us. Beneath the language. Beneath the DNA. Waiting not to be taught, but to be remembered. When knowledge is no longer just light in the abstract, but begins to take form, entering into structure, symbol, and sacred body grammar, then the inevitable follows. Intervention. Because once light has been encoded clearly enough to be transmitted, it can also be seized. What was once whispered between layers of existence now becomes text. And text once written can be burned. Not every page lost to fire is an accident. Some were destroyed precisely because they were too clear. No longer metaphor but blueprint. No longer myth, but instruction. And in a world built on maintaining control, that kind of clarity could not be allowed to survive. At the heart of ancient knowledge's greatest tragedy stands the Library of Alexandria. Not just as a historical loss, but as a symbolic wound. No one knows exactly how many texts perished through fires, invasions, or systematic purges. Sasabin 700. 000. Some say millions of fragments drawn from Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, Sumer, Phoenicia gathered in one last effort to preserve what was slipping away from collective memory. But more haunting than the numbers is the question. What was in those texts that provoked such fear? And it wasn't just Alexandria. In the Egyptian desert near Nagamati, buried in the earth, a trove of lost scripture was found. Gnostic manuscripts that had once formed part of early spiritual traditions, later erased from mainstream religion. These texts spoke of inner light, of direct knowing, of divinity, not as an external force, but as a state of synchronization with the true self. Ideas like these, if made public, would unravel every system of mediation, every hierarchy of spiritual authority, every structure of control. So they were called heresy, not because they were wrong, but because they were too direct. Likewise, many ancient Buddhist texts, especially from Vajrayana and the Dzogchen tradition, were hidden, passed down orally or sealed in caves like those at Dunhuang, not because they were dangerous, but because they were immediate. They required no ritual, no time, only stillness. And from that stillness, the entire structure of universal awareness could reassemble within the reader. And that was intolerable to systems built on deferred power. A sacred text at a certain threshold ceases to be knowledge. It becomes force. It allows the reader to bypass priest-temple doctrine and remember what was once encoded into their very blood. Such a text doesn't need validation. It only needs to be forbidden. Because if even one person were to read it at the right moment, at the moment the system was already beginning to vibrate, then a door long sealed could begin to open again. And perhaps that's why most of the true ancient texts, the raw, unedited ones, never made it into official doctrine. They remain on the fringes, locked in drawers held in private collections, tucked into caves, passed orally or still etched into untranslated clay tablets. They are not dead, only paused. But like any suppressed current, true knowledge can't be erased. It waits for the right touch, not to be explained, only to be recognized. And just like every forbidden scroll ever burned, the essence of those writings was never truly lost because it continues to echo at the lowest frequency of the human mind. A looping signal, not loud enough to hear, but persistent enough to never fully fade. And perhaps if the day ever comes when enough people begin to dream the same dream, draw the same ancient spiral, remember a rhythm they never learned, then that will be the moment the forbidden books read themselves again. Not through paper, but through a consciousness that has finally entered its cycle of restoration. After each wave of fire scorches through libraries, temples, and forbidden books, something strange happens. Knowledge doesn't die. It retreats. It dissolves into the air, sinks into the bloodstream, and waits quietly for the right moment to return. And when it does return, it never comes back the same. It wears a new cloak, speaks a more modern language, appears in more acceptable forms. But beneath the surface, it is always something that has already been known, already lived, already built long ago. As if humanity never truly invents, but only rewrites what was once forgotten. In every age of civilization, there's always a group of people who begin to retell an old story, but in a new system of language. Sometimes it's called religion, sometimes philosophy, sometimes science. They speak of order beneath chaos, of cycles hiding within randomness, of a cosmic will that operates through geometry, frequency, and synchronization. But what makes these efforts so haunting is this: they always arrive late, after the true knowledge has already been buried. That's when the simulations begin. And no matter how refined, a simulation is still memory stripped of its soul. The pyramids are no longer understood as resonant machines. They become tombs. Mandalas are no longer maps of consciousness. They become decorative art. Sacred chants are no longer activation codes. They become music. Humanity looks at what were once tools of awakening and turns them into objects of decoration, worship, remembrance, forgetting that they were once devices for engaging with cosmic memory. This doesn't happen just once. It happens over and over again, like a person with amnesia, never fully erased, but never fully whole. They still react, still repeat fragments of sentences, still perform behaviors they can't explain. Humanity is much the same. After each reset, there is always a group that feels something deeper and begins rebuilding. Calendars, temples, moral systems, schools of thought. But then again and again, those systems are assimilated, oversimplified, co-opted for control, and slowly fall into forgetfulness once more. Perhaps that's why every peak of civilization is mirrored by a kind of spiritual decline. Not because people are weak, but because they've forgotten the original purpose of the structures they now live within. Tools for awakening become tools for administration. Codes become hollow rituals. Symbols are boxed, rigidified, then severed from the senses. And in the end, knowledge is no longer transmitted, only replicated. But just like DNA knows how to repair itself across generations, cosmic memory works the same way. It doesn't need to be preserved perfectly. It only needs to be reawakened at the right rhythm. When someone at some moment in time touches the right shape, breathes in sync with the right pulse, align with the proper cycle, the ancient will rise again within a modern mind. It doesn't require total recall, just enough to rewrite the script one more time. And maybe that loop is the essence of humanity's journey. Not to preserve what cannot be held forever, but to prove that true memory doesn't need to be continuous, only precise in its return. No one remembers everything, but everyone holds a piece. And if those pieces align, even just once in a cycle, then what was burned, buried, rewritten, will reappear. Not in blinding revelation, but in a whisper of recognition. I've known this before. There is a kind of forgetting that comes from time, and a kind that comes from deliberate substitution. If the previous parts were about recalling the ancient patterns lost through natural cycles of amnesia, then now we arrive at something more stubborn. A wisdom that has been blurred not through decay but by being polished. Polished until it shines brightly yet loses all depth. Smoothed until nothing reflects but a surface. And perhaps the most painful part is this. We still call it history. History, as modern humanity receives it, was not written to awaken deep memory, but to reinforce shallow order. It was not designed to help us remember what we already knew, but to convince us to believe what someone else defined. With timelines, names, milestones, categories, everything becomes neat, digestible, logical, and testable in a multiple-choice exam. But what's lost in this version is the layered complexity of time. The truth that each historical fact is a crude cross-section of something far more intricate. Civilizations are presented as if they were isolated. Sumer, Egypt, Harappa, China, the Maya, the Inca. No connection, no simultaneity, no shared pattern. But when we dig beneath architectural alignment, symbolic languages, star maps, phonetics, sacred physics, we see these cultures were once bound by an older logic. Not just cultural similarity, but a system code, as if all civilizations once ran on the same software and were later fragmented and reformatted by hands that no longer wanted the whole picture to be seen. The blurring of wisdom doesn't always come from burning books. Sometimes it comes from rewriting them in language so polished no one thinks to question it. The Greeks recorded Egyptian knowledge as if it were their own, though they themselves said they studied at southern temples. Medieval Europe called the post-Roman era the Dark Ages, even while Indian, Persian, Chinese, and Islamic thought was flourishing. Humanity's history is told as a linear climb from Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago to now, while tools, maps, carvings, and monuments whisper of older epochs. When intelligence peaked, then vanished. Who blurred it? Perhaps no singular force. Perhaps it's simply the nature of every power system to re-enter itself in memory. Every empire rewrites time to place itself at the origin. Every institutional religion alters symbols to declare itself the only path to light. Every dominant ideology defines enlightenment so that only its road leads there. And from these revisions official history emerges. Shiny, orderly, efficient, but reflecting only itself. The more dangerous result is this. When light becomes a tool to blur, people lose the ability to see that they're seeing nothing at all. They don't doubt. They believe not because they are ignorant, but because they've been denied the right to ask the foundational question. Do we really know what we think we know? And is what we know even what truly happened? But no matter how polished the mirror becomes, at some point cracks appear when the reflection glitches. Is when a distorted image slips through. When a shock wave from the deep layers of memory rises up and shatters the mirror from within. That's when the old buried questions re-emerge. who rewrote memory, who decided what deserves to be remembered and what has been labeled myth. Just because it doesn't match the curriculum, perhaps true wisdom still exists. Not in books, but in the act of doubting what we once believed was unquestionable. And maybe the journey doesn't begin with learning something new, but by looking in the mirror and realizing that the surface polished most perfectly may reflect the least truth of all. There's an old fear that when knowledge is banned, burned, distorted, or buried, it will vanish. But ancient texts disagree. They don't speak of knowledge as a possession that can be stolen, but as a flow, a memory current, a form of light that can be hidden, but never destroyed. And if light never disappears, then the real question is, how does it return? Not through books, not through temples, but through new bodies, new forms of life, new humans born seemingly for the sole purpose of reawakening what was once forgotten. That's when knowledge is no longer learned, but lived again. Reincarnation then isn't only for the soul. It applies to knowledge itself. In the Upanishads and the ancient Vedas of India, there's a belief that the sages never truly die. They simply withdraw their energy into the source, waiting for the moment when the world drifts out of balance to return in new form to realign the wheel of Dharma. No one holds the scrolls. They are the scrolls. Thought doesn't need to be passed down on paper. It's encoded into time itself through rebirth. In Tibet, the Tulku tradition of lamas who reincarnate in cycles is not mystical metaphor, but a memory preservation system. When a lineage of wisdom faces extinction, a child is born not to learn but to remember. Gnostic scriptures speak of a true light exiled from this world always seeking a way back through embodied channels. Individuals who resonate with the frequency of primordial awareness. Not everyone can carry it, but when forgetting reaches a critical threshold, light will find a way through someone quiet enough, solitary enough, invisible enough to go unnoticed, yet holding a question no one ever taught them. And from that question, knowledge returns, not as command, but as a question that refuses to be silenced. In the Book of Enoch, even after the Watchers were sealed away, there is a promise that at the end of the cycle, a righteous one would be born, carrying tablets inscribed with light, and from them the heavens would open once again, not because they forced them open, but because the code was embedded within them, waiting to be run. This same idea appears across cultures. The marked one, the chosen, the one who remembers without ever having been taught. Not a prophet, but a carrier of resonance, like an ancient wavelength finally meeting the right receiver after centuries of silence. And in that we find a strange insight. Knowledge doesn't need to be preserved to survive. It can slip into seeds, into dreams, into DNA, into a glance, into a sensation. It can move past language. And when it meets the right environment, it reactivates like a sudden crack through the ice of a frozen lake. When someone touches something too deep to have read in any book, we call them a genius. But maybe they're just someone who remembered the right frequency at the right cycle in the right place and knowledge came through them like wind meeting the leaf. Maybe that's why ancient civilizations didn't despair when wisdom was lost. They built temples using sacred geometry. They encoded knowledge into myth. They embedded memory into stone markings. They hid messages in ritual, so that even if all else was erased, one person born sensitive enough would still feel that something is truer than what is being taught. That person wouldn't seek new knowledge. They would simply sit down and quietly remember. After everything has been written, burned, forbidden, remembered in silence, cycled through time, and reborn into form, there remains one final possibility, rarely spoken aloud. Maybe we are no longer the readers of the text. Maybe we are the text, not written on paper, not carved in stone, but a living structure, a conscious organism encoded with fragments of a sacred blueprint, long ago shattered, stripped from collective memory, but still intact in the way we move, feel, dream, and breathe. What we call modern society with its languages, systems, laws, technologies, and networks may not be a triumph of innovation, but a subconscious attempt to replicate a system that once existed. Like a child who once glimpsed a city made of light and sound, growing up in a world of concrete, and trying to recreate that memory with bricks, wires, and steel. The more advanced we become, the more we begin to resemble that forgotten memory, yet still miss its essence. A crude simulation, a smudged reprint. Look closer at the shape of our world. Cities laid out in grid-like circuits. Transportation moving in rhythm and pulse. People living by the ticking of clocks. A kind of force frequency. The internet spreads like a synthetic nervous system. Media systems are tiered like chakras in a collective body. Every element mirrors the shape of something larger. Something we're unconsciously trying to rebuild. As if human civilization is blindly trying to recall a system that once operated with perfect symmetry but lost its source code. We structure but forget why structure matters. We repeat cycles without realizing we are living in a calendar. We build artificial intelligence and externalized memory trying to mirror what we once knew internally. Our greatest inventions, networks, encryption, biometrics, new rock may not be progress at all, but signs that memory is attempting to reconfigure itself. Not for the first time, but for the thousandth. And perhaps the deep unease at the core of modern life. The sense of disconnection, emptiness, aimlessness doesn't come from not having arrived at something new. It comes from having been whole before and then being split apart and then forgetting. Everything we call civilization might just be a draft. A fractured, buggy attempt to rewrite what was once seamless. We don't live in a glorious age of progress. We live in a trial version of a brilliant design that's been lost. And because we are copies, we constantly feel the absence of something we can't name. A glitch in the knowing. A line missing from the code. A sentence that was never written. That feeling cannot be filled by science or theology because it's not a gap in thought. It's a frequency out of sync. And only when we stop trying to build the world and begin listening to the structure we already are, will this living text begin to reveal itself. Not to be read, but to be activated. Maybe we don't need to go looking for any more ancient texts. Maybe the only thing missing is a silence deep enough to hear again the voice that's always been speaking. Not from books, but from within the rhythm of our own heartbeat. After we've wandered through erased cycles, burned manuscripts, silenced memories, misunderstood monuments, and even our own bodies seen as unfinished living texts, one final question begins to emerge like a quiet gravitational pull. Where is all this leading? Could it be that every ancient symbol, every lost civilization, every ritual, every encoded pattern, every vibrating structure, every human-shaped God, all of them are simply different expressions of the same thing? A thing never fully named yet always present beneath every layer of form. And if that's true, what is that source? The ancient Egyptians called it Zepi the first time, but not a moment in time, a state, a dimension where everything coexisted in perfect harmonic presence. Hinduism speaks of Brahman, not a deity but the undivided field of awareness where all separations are illusion. Buddhism names it Shunyata, the conceptless ground from which all forms arise. Yet none are inherently real. In Kabbalah it is in soft infinite undefined unnamed the root of all light. The Aboriginal people of Australia simply call it Dreamtime, a sacred unmeasured realm where ancestral beings sang creation into being and left behind frequency trails for future generations to follow. Each of these names, however different, does not describe a person or a place. They describe a field, a source condition, not spatial, not temporal, but foundational frequency, a state where all consciousness, all structures, all symbols, all bodies, all texts are just temporary reverberations like reflections on a still lake stirred into patterns by different frequencies. Each unique, each fleeting, but all returning to the same origin, water. So if every story of gods, of floods, of ancient wisdom, of sacred geometry, of builders, of watchers, of avatars, is a ripple, then the source is the lake before it was touched. That source isn't somewhere, but everywhere bears its trace. It isn't in the past, but all pasts point back to it. It doesn't live in scripture, but every scripture echoes its voice. And when enough fragments are gathered, enough symbols, enough cycles, enough memories, enough questions, not a single answer emerge. Is something simultaneous, a resonance, a state of recognition. You no longer need to search for the source because you are the point where the source is remembering itself. Maybe every great civilization never invented anything. They were simply closer to the source and thus remembered more clearly. But when their vibration drifted too far, memory began to fade. They rebuilt, repeated, worked, and eventually forgot they had ever been close. Perhaps ancient texts weren't written to inform, but to reorient, to guide the reader back, not to a place, but to the space between form and light, where awareness once again touches its origin. If every ancient text was simply the first chapter of a book that never truly closed, then what we call the present is not a break from the past. It's the next page waiting to be written. Not in stone, not on parchment, not through sacred geometry, but through action, choice, and the way we understand ourselves and the world we inhabit. And when we look back over the long journey from the first light descending into form through civilizations that remembered and forgot through the recurring loop of Bill Earn hide hint awaken silence rewrite, the clearest truth is this. We are not here to end anything. We are being called to write what comes next. It is no coincidence that in this moment humanity is simultaneously revisiting everything. Technology, mythology, star charts, ancient geometry, religion, genetic memory, quantum physics, meditation, indigenous ritual, and artificial intelligence. It is no accident that in this generation we are building the largest telescopes ever conceived while rediscovering the oldest cave drawings on Earth. We are not living in an ordinary age. We are standing at a crossroad of convergence where long-divided layers of memory are beginning to speak to each other again. And if that's true, the question is no longer what do we know? It becomes what are we leaving for those who come after? Because just as the ancients once carved vibrations into stone and aligned symbols with stars, we too are leaving memory behind. Not through grand monuments, but through data, through code, through the definitions we apply to humanity, the values we compromise, the ideas we embed in the architecture of civilization. The question is, are we repeating an old manuscript? Or are we still enough to write a new chapter? A chapter that doesn't repeat distortion, doesn't seek to rebuild lost glory, doesn't mistake simulation for rebirth, but listens to what has never yet been said. Perhaps the text of this era has no fixed form, but instead exists as a collective frequency, a field of global awareness. Every personal act is a word, every deep thought a sentence, every awakening a turning point, and the whole of this civilization, whether or not it's written down, will be recorded in the field of the cosmos, just as the first ones once etched silence into stone, not with language, but with perfectly timed presence. If that's true, then maybe the most important thing right now is not to say more, but to pause long enough to realize that we are living on a page that's still open. No one handed us the pen, but every act still leaves a mark. And perhaps in some distant future, someone won't need to read this text at all.